Just as a briefly introduction, like this seminar is oriented for students of these two universities. So we have today with us between 20 and 30 students from Chile, Germany, and other countries that are studying biology and arts mostly. We have some closed sessions that are only for the students, but today is an open session, and we will have two more on sentient and visionary ecologies. The team, like I said, is Eli. Maybe Eli, me, and Gesa, you want to present yourself briefly before we go for the first speaker?
Yes, thank you, Jens. So welcome everybody.
Yo creo que se pueden comprimir y hacer que sea uno solo.
Ya.
Mira, el de más abajo lo dejaría tal cual.
Eli, ¿lo podéis silenciar?
No, lo que hiciste recién.
¿Le podéis activar el audio?
Sí.
El tercero lo dejaría tal cual, porque es como un requerimiento.
Yeah, okay. So welcome everybody. Thank you, Jens. Really glad to be here today in our first open session of the Queer, Sentient and Visionary Ecology Seminar. We have been working on with the Jens and also with the amazing and great support of Mia and Gesa. And this is, as Jens said, a collaboration between the LMU, Rachel Carson Center, and the Universidad de Concepción in the south of Chile, specifically the arts faculty where I teach. I'm a visual artist and I've been teaching also there since almost 3 years. I created a lab on art and ecology, and now we are really happy to expand also the lab with this seminar and workshop. As Jens said, today we will focus on queer ecologies, and then we will have two more open sessions on sentient and visionary ecologies coming later this month and also in January. So yeah, welcome everybody, and I'll pass the word to Gesa.
Thank you, Ellie. Yeah, it looks like the numbers are still rising. We're 54 right now. Welcome also from my side. My name is Gesa Lüdecke, and I am the Director of Graduate Programs at the Rachel Carson Center that is also based in Munich at the LMU. And the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society is an international and an interdisciplinary center for research and education in the environmental humanities and the social sciences. And I am very happy that I had the opportunity to be part of this really great endeavor, and I'm very much looking forward to our speakers of today and the entire semester.
Yeah, cool, then it's only me missing, right? Introducing myself. So welcome everybody. So I'm really happy that so many people are joining. So my name is Maria Stockenweiter, or people use usually Mia for me. And I'm an assistant professor, or in German it's called Akademische Rätin, for aquatic ecology at the LMU. And it looks like that it's that I'm the big PI in that. I'm not. I'm just on paper the PI getting the money. So the big work was on Jens and Eli's shoulders for sure, and they also had this great idea, putting everything together. So I'm happy that I could do something to support that it's running. So, and then we got Gesa on board, which was really a good thing, I think. And yeah, so I'm really looking forward as well to all these great speakers we have today. And I'm really happy that we also have a speaker from our own university here. So that's really cool. And yeah, let's get started, I would say.
One more person. Kara, may you also present yourself, please?
Sure, I'm Kara. I'm in Berlin. I'm a landscape architect and an urban researcher, and I'm helping the team getting this function. So yeah, let's go.
Thank you all. So briefly introducing you to the structure, we will have these speakers now, 15 minutes each, and I encourage you to write down your questions in the chat, and Kara will read them because we are too many and sometimes it's a bit chaotic, so we can keep it more simple that way. So during the talks, you may write down anything you may ask in the chat. Well, the first speaker has to leave early, Silke, so we also may do one question session right after she presents before she leaves. Then we will have a little breakout room session so we get to know each other in smaller groups, and then we wrap it up, and that's it. And we hope you had a really nice session. So our first speaker is Silke Beat. She is, like Mia said, here in Munich. She teaches botany, mycology, and world terrestrial ecosystems at the LMU. And her study organisms are lichens and higher plants. And her research focuses on population genetics and ecological genomics. And Silke, now the stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Jens, for the nice introduction. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the queer strategies of fungal reproduction today. First, let me share my screen with you. Can you see my screen, everybody? Yeah, okay, great.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so fungal reproduction is really diverse and interesting if you just wrap your head around it. Let me tell you a little bit about fungi, and I want to first start with reproduction and sexuality. I want to talk about mating type systems, mating type loci, and mate recognition in fungi. And then come to one very special case, and that is the ménage à trois. You know that exists in fungi. So the fungi, they're very versatile organisms. They're both unicellular forms like baker's yeast, which probably everybody of you knows or has at least eaten in some ways or drunk. And there's also multicellular forms. The multicellular fungi, their body consists of hyphae. So these are thread-like tiny microscopic structures. And the sum of the hyphae, they form the so-called mycelium. The fungi are hermaphrodites, so they can produce both male and female structures. So they can be both the mom and the dad, and all of them. So yeah, so they're hermaphroditic. And then the sexual identity of fungi is determined by the so-called mating types. So a mycelium has a specific mating type, and that determines with whom this mycelium can mate. Let's talk a little bit about reproduction, because not all of you are biologists. I think I should give you some background. So reproduction is the generation of new independent individuals that are independent from their parents. And there can be either one parent or there can be two parents. If we look at asexual reproduction, what happens is that, you know, there's an immediate development of an offspring from a parent's tissue. And then this offspring is genetically identical to its parent. And the offsprings are, so to say, clones from the parent. And in fungi, you have that, for instance, very prominently in the mold fungi. And they are making these tiny round conidia, so these are also called conidiospores. These can break off and then be dispersed to another place and form a new mycelium. So, you know, this here is the hyphae, and then this fungus makes conidia here. But asexual reproduction is also found in plants. And one case is like the bulbils of Calanthoe, that you can see here, where on the edge of the leaf, actually tiny plants are developing that then fall down and grow into a new plant. In lichens, you have this outgrowth on the surface that make like tiny balls of fungi and the photobiont, so an alga or a cyanobacterium, and those can break off and then be dispersed and establish a new individual that will be genetically identical to its parent. There are certain advantages and disadvantages to asexual reproduction. So one advantage of making clones is that there is no cost associated with sexuality. So for once, the well-adapted genotypes, if they're well-adapted for the environment, they will stay around. So they can then very efficiently colonize a specific habitat.
I hope.
And then there's also no time or energy needed to find a mate. But there's also disadvantages. So it doesn't generate any genetic variability. And so because of this, it's not possible then that if fungi reproduce clonally, that they are adapting in some ways to changing environmental conditions, because they're just the same as their parent, essentially. When you look at sexual reproduction, this normally involves a lot of processes, including mate recognition and the fusion of gametes, so sperm and egg cells, for instance, and ploidy changes, and so on. And in fungi, the fertilization happens by the fusion of different cells. So it can be either somatic cells, or it can be specific structures that are called gametangia, or a somatic cell can fuse with a gametangium to produce then a fertilized structure. Let's talk about mate recognition in yeast. So in yeast, we have two mating types, an A type and an alpha type. And now let's look at the alpha type. This alpha type produces pheromones, as you can see here. First of all, you have them fused together, so they're produced in the endoplasmatic reticulum, then produced like cut down kind of by the Golgi apparatus to end up with like one single of these yellow dots, and then with the vesicle they are excreted to the outside of the cell, and then they can be sensed by a receptor, this little black structure here of the MAT-A cell. So MAT-A cell has this round little structure here. You see that's the receptor. So it senses then that an alpha cell is present. And if you look at the MAT-A cell, it produces an A factor, as you can see. It's this type of factor here that has like some lipid structure, and it's exported with an ABC transporter, which is called STE6. And once this has gotten out of the cell, then it can be sensed by the alpha cell. And when both of them are sensing each other, then these fungi, they do something really cute. These cells, they are making little protrusions, as you can see here. So they grow towards each other with these elongated shapes. And then these cells are called the so-called schmooze. So, and then they start to kind of contact each other, and they fuse with one another to create a diploid cell. So this is how the mating works in Baker's yeast, typically. In fungi, there's different types of mating systems. So bipolar and tetrapolar mating system. And the bipolar mating system is just like what I showed you just now in yeast. You have like an A and an alpha type, and if two different ones come together, they can mate. And then usually if you have A and A or alpha and alpha cells, they will not do anything with each other. So if you have a mating of an A with an alpha mycelium, you have like 4 different offspring coming up. So 2 A's and 2 alphas. This is just the Mendelian rules essentially. So these have these different mating types, so 2 alpha and 2 A cells. So it means like 50% of these offspring can mate with one another. So you have a possibility for 50% of inbreeding. And there is tetrapolar mating system that's mainly in the Agaricomycotina, so like the blue fungus that you see in the bottom here. So these have 2 mating type loci, which are called A and B, just for illustration here. And each of them has many alleles. And I have only here shown a case with 2 different alleles. So the first one that you see, like A1B1, is one of the fungal mycelia, and the second mycelium is A2B2, and they are different in both mating type loci, so they can mate. And also, if you have like A2B1 can mate with A1B2. They just need to be different in 2 mating type loci. But if they are the same in only one of them, for instance, then there will be no mating. So if you think of that this first crossing here is happening, so A1, B1 with A2, B2, then you have like 4 different offspring. You see those here. And if one looks at which of these ones can then be fertile with one another, it's so that only 4 of altogether 16 combinations are fertile. So we have a possibility of 25% of inbreeding. Yeah, so the tetrapolar mating system, as I said, is mainly found in the Agaricomycotina. You know, like most of the mushrooms that we're eating belong to them, like the Agaricus bisporus, for instance, which is the champignon mushroom that a lot of people are eating. And bipolar mating system is mainly in Ascomycota, for instance, truffles, and most of the lichens are also belonging to that group here. Now this is just the case with like a bipolar heterothallic system that, as I showed you before in the yeast, where you have an alpha and an A cell that can mate with one another to create then a diploid yeast cell. Or this is also found in Neurospora crassa in the sodariomycetes, where you have again A and alpha mycelia that can mate with one another and then produce fruiting bodies in the process. There's also something called pseudo-homotalism. Some fungi contain more than one nucleus in each cell. Here we have a case where we have a MUT alpha containing nucleus and one that contains the mating type MUT A, so all together in one spore. So because of this, because both mating types are present, then selfing is possible. So they don't need a partner at all to make offspring. They can self. One of the cases here would be Podospora ansarina in the sodariomycetes. For homotalism, then you have like either the 2 mating type idiomorphs fused, or you have them just unlinked in 2 different sections of the genome. But because both mating type idiomorphs are present in either case, they will be able to do selfing. And then there's a very interesting case, namely the Baker's yeast can be trans. So it can switch its mating type. So an A cell can become an alpha cell. And then when it has become an alpha cell, it can then mate with its daughter cell, in principle, an A cell. And how is this working? How does A become alpha? It's in such a way, as you see here on the lower right, this Saccharomyces cerevisiae, it contains 2 silent mating type cassettes, and you know they can be cut out. So you see here, this the MUT A cell has a MUT A cassette here, this red one, and this can be cut out by a specific enzyme. It's called a homing endonuclease that just cuts this out and places an alpha cassette in its place. As you can see, well, now we have essentially changed from A to alpha. And then this cell that used to be an A has become an alpha and can mate with an A cell. Yeah, so there's 2 trans yeasts. So very interesting, I think. And we have one more very, very special mating type mechanism in yeast cells. And that is polyamories with the ménage à 3 mating. And look at this. So this is the situation where we have like many alpha cells and just a few A cells. And the A cells, they make their pheromone. So this A factor that I've shown you before. And it's actually just enough if a little bit of this A factor is around, then these alpha cells, they are actually sensing this A factor, and they can actually then mate with one another. So then you have like the situation where you can have like different types of mating in the population. So you can have these alpha cells mating with one another because they have sensed this A factor. And then you can, of course, still have like A and alpha mating with one another. So depending on the frequency of cells, you know, you have like either this unisexual kind of mating between alpha cells or A alpha matings. So ménage à 3, it needs a third partner for something to happen. So with that, I want to start to wrap up. So you have learned about, the many ways of fungal reproduction, about mating systems a little bit, mate recognition and mating type loci, and about this very special mechanism of ménage à trois. So the fungi have evolved really unique and diverse reproductive strategies, and the binary concepts of the sexes, which we humans are so used to, doesn't really apply to the fungi. So they have evolved different mechanisms to do something or to avoid it. And some of them can even switch their mating type from one to another, as we've seen, or they can use additional partners and mate in a ménage à trois. So the fungi, they're really queer organisms. And the binary concepts that we have in mind as people doesn't really fit to them. So I hope that, next time when you are actually going to eat something like this, like a beautiful fungus, like this here is my dinner for tonight, flammulina, think about what kind of sexuality it has. And thank you very much for your attention.
Awesome, Silke. Thank you so much for your talk. We have a couple of questions because I think you do have to leave early. So I'll just read from the chat. And the first one is from Emily. Are there fungi which can reproduce both sexually and asexually and change their method of reproduction based on the environment?
Yeah, there's definitely fungi which can reproduce both sexually and asexually. So in many lichens, they are like this. So, and it is so that, many, they can reproduce clonally. And then sometimes when the conditions are good, they can do sex. So, and it depends really on the environment, if they can be sexual or not, and obviously on the presence of partners. And, in lichens, when they are like in more moist environments, they're more likely also to be able to do reproduction by sex.
Emily, I hope that answered your question. I think similarly, Jens actually asked if fungi can mate with every other possible mating type except for their own mating type.
Yeah, well, it's kind of, in the one case, you have only two, right? And then there's some exception how it still can happen. And then the other case, you really, in the case of the tetrapolar mating system, they really need to be different in two loci. So, yeah, so I don't know if I answered that. Okay.
Jens is shaking his head, so I think. Okay, so this one's a bit tricky, and maybe Alice, you could help me out. But it says in the pseudo-homothallism, which genes are expressed when there are two nuclei? Randomly, both, or only one?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think people are still doing a lot of research about that. It's a good case for gene expression studies. And you have actually sometimes mycelia where there's the nuclei that can kind of move between adjacent compartments also. And then by this, you can actually then in the end get like different sections of the mycelium that are A and other sections that are alpha. And so that can like happen, that you have like within a mycelium, you have like heterogeneity. So part being A, another part being alpha, for instance. And then those parts they can then mate with each other. Yeah, so it really depends. And I think that there's very little known about how the different, if you have like the binucleate cells, so this N plus N phase, what is then the nucleus that really produces everything, or how they are communicating with one another. I think that's still kind of rather open.
Okay, so we have one more question, and that's from Laura. And she says, you talked about the trans function, so you can get from A to alpha. So can they also change back or only once?
I have only heard about from in one direction. I think the other direction I haven't heard about, but it wouldn't surprise me. This enzyme, the homing endonuclease, it's just cutting and then pasting essentially. It should be possible that it goes back again, but yeah, I've only read about in one direction, but I don't see why it shouldn't go back also.
Okay, and so one more question from Geva. So some snails can change sex depending on who they are mating with. What is the difference here to fungi reproduction?
Yeah, the fungi, they're kind of, yeah, it's a bit similar in this way. If you think of yeast cells, at least, you know, they can kind of change their sex, yeah, when they encounter somebody. Yeah, it's similar. But if you think of now the filamentous fungi that have these mycelia and hyphae, I think this is maybe more complicated there. So, and I think that's quite different. And in snails, I think mostly they're kind of they're actually hermaphrodites, right? So they both have like the two types of organs, so they can kind of fertilize each other.
Okay, Geza, I hope that answered your question. And Van Bastian, he actually put a link for a reading suggestion on the topic. And Zoka, I think if anyone else has questions, if you wanted to drop your email into the chat, then maybe people could message you directly for maybe also some resources on what you have. But if that's all the questions, then maybe we can move on to the next speaker. And yeah, thank you so much. Genzi, if there's anything you want to add.
No, I think that was an amazing talk, Silke. Thank you a lot, because sexual reproduction is already a hard topic, and in fungi it's even harder, and you made an amazing briefing of that really complex world. So really thank you. Yeah, I know you have to leave soon, so also thank you for being here. And now we have Madeleine, who actually, it's really fun because I contact her through Gardiner, who is also in this session now. And Gardiner wrote that really beautiful text about Steven Universe, a cartoon, and queer ecology. And I really recommend it to you. I will share it later down in the chat. And Madeleine here, it's actually a recent graduate of the Environmental Humanities Master Program at the University of Utah, in the United States. And her research creation primarily explores petroleum culture and the potentials of pleasure as a mode of resistance and reimagining. But some of her pleasures include spicy curries, stone fruits, and spots of water in arid places. So welcome, Madeleine. Thank you for being here, and the stage is all yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you for that really interesting presentation on fungi. I learned a lot, very much out of my wheelhouse. So thank you for that. Okay, I am going to try to share my screen.
We see it. Looks good.
Okay, I think I need to change something on my end because sorry, not great with the technology. I need to share my screen but still see my notes, and it's not letting me. Does anyone have tips on that? No. Okay.
Yes, if you do share screen, but you go to advanced options and do partial share screen, then you should be able to get it into presenter view and only share like the pink part of your slide.
Okay. Sorry about this. Let me try again.
We're all human. We're all patient. No stress.
Oh.
I think you're able to drag it out to make it bigger as well, to like fit exactly what you're trying to show.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, I think.
Perfect.
Okay, cool. Thank you. All right. So So again, my name's Madeline Bavely, and I just graduated in the spring from the University of Utah's Environmental Humanities Master's Program. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit about the research creation that was my thesis there. All right, so, sorry, technical difficulties, okay. We pleasure in petroleum. It is a pleasure cheap and easy. It is a pleasure indifferent to cause or effect. It is a pleasure predicated on fantasy. Indeed, our relationship with petroleum is complicated. It produces pleasures of convenience, comfort, and commodity. It is also producing our deeply displeasurable climate crisis. It is a substance soaked in contradiction, and yet it is a substance so commonplace. Petroleum is everywhere and everything. Though the slippery substance in delight and in destruction remains inconspicuous and resists interpretation. Energy epistemologies terms this tension of ever-presence and always absence. And as our climate crisis intensifies, scholars across the humanities have come to understand that its causes and effects are too embedded and too all-encompassing for a scientific approach alone to be sufficient in addressing it. The environmental humanities has emerged as an essential alternative approach. Out of the environmental humanities has emerged the energy humanities. The energy humanities, as Imre Seisman and Dominique Boyer explain, endeavors to first grasp the full intricacies of our imbrication with energy systems, and second, map out other ways of being, behaving, and belonging in relation to both old and new forms of energy. Scholarship in the energy humanities pivots around the 2010 BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill, an event that punctuated the routineness of petroleum through aggressively asserting the presence of the already always there substance. But though the BP blowout provided a punctuation, it wasn't a consummate penetrative act. It didn't cause us to reconsider loving oil. Events such as oil spills, explosive and exciting, may rouse recognition, but the slower seepages of petroleum are less apparent, less alluring, less articulated. Indeed, living in oil through injury and pleasure is not easily transmissible as story, and living out of oil is perhaps even less so. And as the energy humanities is a developing field, a diversity of angles and approaches are imperative for interpreting this slippery substance into stories apprehensible and appealing. And while there is, as Seisman and Boyer suggest, a place for sober criticism in the enterprise of the energy humanities, there is also a place for surreal vision and wild imagination. The mainstream environmental movement tends towards the sober, the straight-edged, and the straight. As such, the movement is perceived as serious, sincere, and sometimes sanctimonious. Petroleum importunes instead the surreal and the wild. And so in my intercourse with petroleum, I invoke alternative, i.e. queer, environmental affects and aesthetics that aim to turn on rather than turn off. My intercourse is moderately deviant and mildly drunken. Petroleum is, after all, a substance that simultaneously seduces and sedates. So informed by the theories of Adrienne Marie Brown and Nicole Seymour, who both consider pleasure a mode of resistance, I contend that pleasure can also be a means of reconfiguring our energy epistemologies. My research creation endeavors first to investigate how petroleum produces our present pleasure ways, and second, to imagine potential post-petroleum pleasure ways. Reconfiguring our relationship with petroleum requires reconfiguring our ways of pleasure, our pleasure ways. Our petroleum pleasure ways are predicated on fantasy. And as all fantasies are founded on the improbable and the impossible, there is fallacy in this fantasy as well. Our petroleum pleasure ways place us in a predicament. Petroleum produces the pleasures of convenience, comfort, and commodity, providing for a consumption fast, frictionless, and free from context. Movement is made smooth and speedy. Materials are made supple and single use. Petroleum is also producing our deeply displeasurable climate crisis, prompting rising global temperatures, exacerbation of extreme weather events, acidification of oceans, pollution of air and water, increasing exposure to vector-borne diseases, et cetera, et cetera. Indeed, our relationship with petroleum is, as Stephanie Le-Menager puts it, a bad love. As a result of our relationship with petroleum, the planet has been drastically altered, disproportionately by some, and the consequences, current and coming, are distressing, disastrous, and deadly, entirely displeasurable, entirely contradictory to the purpose of petroleum. These petroleum pleasureways have privileged particular categories of pleasures and particular classes of people. Pleasures of a particular sort, though produced in excess, have been rendered a scarce resource, surfeit for a few, scant for most. resulting in pleasureways uneven, unsustainable, and in many ways unsatisfactory. Unraveling these petroleum pleasureways is requisite to reimagining post-petroleum futures just and joyful. Though relinquishing petroleum does not require renouncing pleasure, as is often portrayed by those in and in opposition to the mainstream environmental movement. The mainstream environmental movement is conventionally associated with responsibility and restraint, austerity and asceticism, purity and piety. It refuses frivolity or flaws, adornment or artificiality, irreverence or indecency, and it resists gaiety, glee, and pleasure. As such, the cultivation of pleasure could be considered a profligate pursuit. But characterizing pleasure as unproductive or unnecessary is neither attractive nor accurate. Rather, pleasure provides an alternative ecological ethic that is both expanding and enlivening. After all, the pursuit of pleasure is constituent to human and more than human nature cultures alike. So centering pleasure is neither imprudent nor improvident, and is imperative. Relinquishing petroleum requires a reconfiguring of our pleasure ways, a reframing of, rather than a refraining from pleasure. It requires not only expanding access to pleasure, but expanding the accepted forms of pleasure, a redistributing and a remaking of pleasure. Pleasure is not aimed at accumulation, but on acknowledging the already always there abundance. Cultivating pleasures of this sort, sustaining and sustainable, is not remissness, but resistance. Indeed, our pleasure ways of present that privilege certain categories of pleasure and certain classes of people are detrimental and dull. So as we reimagine potential post-petroleum pleasure ways, we might recognize the ways that pleasures function and flourish on the fringe. Indeed, as we explore new ways of being, behaving, and belonging, we might appreciate the myriad and multi-specied ways of being, behaving, and belonging that have already always existed, the already always there abundance.
Madeline, can I just ask one thing? I think
Yeah.
we have a few non-native speakers, so if there's any way you could just slow down just a tiny, teeny bit, I think
Sure.
some of our speakers would really appreciate that, just so they can also ask some good questions.
Absolutely.
Go for it.
Okay. All right, so in my research creation, I explore the perspectives provided by the fringy pleasureways of kink and camp. And I will share a little bit of those creations that I am working on. So here is the mock movie poster for this project in progress, Deep Throat Horizon, is an illustration of how petroleum produces our present pleasureways. I put out for petroleum, and you probably do too. Deep Throat Horizon inaugurates a new subgenre of adult film, the petroporno. As crude as can be, it asks of America, how far will we go to get off on oil before we get off of oil? Indeed, our petroleum pleasureways are predicated on fantasy, a fantasy founded on fervid extraction and emission. Caught in the midst of pleasure pursuit, the audience is confronted with the flaccidness of their and our fantasy. It is a fossil fuel film on getting fucked. Will you watch or will you look away? And the mock product line Crude Chains is an imagining of potential post-petroleum pleasureways. Has the climate crisis got you down? Crude Chains is here to help. Feel sexy and sustainable with these BDSM toys handcrafted and crocheted from unwanted plastics. There's a lot of plastic out there, so why let it end up in the ocean gagging sea turtles when we can gag ourselves with it instead? With your one-of-a-kind eco kink, you can feel good about being bad. It's time to spread pleasure all over the planet. Kink practices are not procreative, but creative. Rather than reproducing that which is, these practices reimagine that which could be. Kink includes an array of sexual preferences and practices, encompassing all manner of erotic esoterica. Kink is characterized by considerations of consent, a convention of aftercare, and creative adaptations. But mostly, kink is, in the words of my Dory, the supernova of kink herself, all about how to play together and play better together. So as we reconfigure pleasureways for post-petroleum futures just, joyful, and full of play, kink provides perspectives on playing together and playing better together in our increasingly weird and warm world. Plastic is a cheap and easy petroleum pleasureway. It is a seemingly supernatural substance that shapeshifts into a myriad of forms, serves a multitude of functions, and satisfies many a fantasy. It is a material mystic and metamorphic, yet entirely mundane. Since the 1950s, around 8.3 billion tons of plastic have been produced. And as a delightfully disposable substance, most plastic is promptly discarded. This profusion of discarded plastic is one of the primary ejaculates of our petroleum pleasureways. And though disposable, plastic is durable, per-durable. And so even as we reimagine post-petroleum pleasureways, our plastic progeny will remain. CAMP provides perspectives on potential post-petroleum pleasureways for a planet pullulating in plastic. Rather than disappearing our discarded waste, we might dress it up for display instead. CAMP reveals, reappropriates, even relishes that which is considered as trash. And though CAMP can't render trash benign or beneficial, it can reread, reanimate, and remember. CAMP also allows for entering into relation with, for taking responsibility for our plastic progeny will persist. And so as we reimagine potential post-petroleum pleasureways, CAMP might allow us to consider how we are enmeshed and entangled, penetrated and penetrating, already always soaking in one another's secretions. All right, sorry about being too fast for in my speaking. So if there's anything I can repeat, please let me know.
Thank you, Madeleine.
Yeah, that was really awesome. Yeah, if there's any questions from the beginning, I think feel free to throw them out. I myself have a question. One, into the film that you're making, can you just talk about what, I mean, who was also your audience in these, and what are you are making this film, correct? Or is it a proposal for a concept for a film?
It currently is not a film that is being made. It's a project I started in my master's program, and it's very much in progress. It's more of a concept. It may not ever be a full-length film.
Yeah.
It might be
Concept
made into a trailer or something of that sort. But for now, it is just a movie poster to incite thought.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so yeah, just to that then, like, one is, who is your audience with these with these concepts? Because they're super evocative, they're super I guess, I mean, I don't want to say bold, but I think I can imagine that there'd be some reactions, and it'd be really interesting also to hear about the reactions that you're getting, especially also in these sort of academic circles or outside of academic circles.
I think the audience I hope to have is through the creation part of the research, is expanding the research to audiences outside of academia by invoking tones and kind of textures that are not the same as academia, because academia itself, as well as mainstream environmentalism, can both be very alienating in their affect. And so translating some of those concepts to a more popular audience is my goal. I think that's why I am looking towards mediums that are more pop cultural and less academic. I suppose pornography is one of the most commonly consumed things in at least American culture, and so it is a medium that more people probably engage in than academic articles.
Yeah. It reminds me of some of the performances that happened at COP26, where they were pouring petroleum on each other outside during some of the meetings. Okay, so here are a couple of questions. So from Gardner, would you imagine aftercare could look like a post-petroleum world?
Great question. I think the idea of aftercare is understanding that pleasure happens in context and it has consequences, and that I think seeking pleasure in capitalism, often we are spared thinking about the context that our pleasures come from. And the idea of aftercare is really contextualizing that and taking responsibility for what happens after we have sought pleasure, because there are always going to be consequences, good or bad, that are associated with those. And I think the kink practice of aftercare really allows us to just put our pleasure in context and take responsibility for what happens after, not just what happens during any pleasure-seeking pursuit, whether it be sexual or otherwise.
And Jackie asks, the idea of centering pleasure and climate justice is super interesting in light of degrowth being a current of eco-socialist thought. So do you think that pleasure and degrowth can exist?
Absolutely. I think what we consider pleasure is in many ways framed, and the energy humanities is understanding also how types of energy inform culture. And I think our pleasure ways have been informed by a petroleum-based culture. And so I think if we can reimagine different pleasures and focus on different pleasures that aren't informed by petroleum, that aren't fed to us by a petroleum culture, then they can absolutely coexist, and could, I think, focusing on those pleasures can help us in that movement towards degrowth. It's just, as I said in my presentation, really a matter of reframing what we consider pleasure, and understanding that petroleum-based pleasures are ultimately displeasurable. And so kind of reflecting on pleasures that are fully pleasurable and don't cause displeasure is very much in line with degrowth, or can be potentially.
Yeah, okay, so similar question in a sense, but would you, from the last question, Zoe, would you intersect your practice with the concept of eco-fetishism? I had some connection issues at the beginning. Maybe you already talked about that, but I don't think you actually had.
No, I did not talk about eco-fetishism. The person who's asking that question, could you define what you mean by eco-fetishism? Because I feel like that could mean a lot of different things, and I want to answer the right question.
Yeah, Zoe, if you want to turn your camera on, go for it. Maybe not. Okay, so I don't know. Van is about to, so issues with connection. Zoe's going to type. So what we could do though is Van has a question, he's typed it, but Van's also about to present. So either Van, you could go ahead and ask it and then lead into your presentation if you'd like.
Yeah, but it has nothing to do with my presentation. So
okay. Well, do you want to ask it? Okay.
So yeah, part of my language, because you use the language as well in your presentation, so I hope it's not a problem. I'm trying to make sense of how like then sex, but you use the word fucking in your presentation. So I wanted to understand like what is the use of the metaphor or this word fucking makes to your understanding of this paradoxical relationship, as if like fucking as the source of pleasure, but also being fucked by oil. So how do you then make sense of this double meaning? Do you think that they coexist, or do you like pleasure comes from this bad relationship, or pleasure comes after this bad relationship? That's what I'm trying to understand. Are they instantly connected, or are they separate in a way?
I will try to answer your question and let me know if I didn't answer it. I guess we have a very intimate relationship with petroleum because we want it to provide us pleasure, and it does very fleetingly, but it causes a lack of pleasure afterwards, or our pleasure in petroleum causes displeasure for other people elsewhere, or other species elsewhere. So it is both pleasurable and deeply displeasurable, depending on how you look at it. I think sex and fucking, the language can mean both, because sometimes we have good sex, sometimes we have bad sex, sometimes we have sex that makes us feel great, sometimes we have sex that makes us feel really shitty. And I think the language speaks to how intimately we interact with petroleum, and especially now with microplastics, we are truly infused with plastic, and we have a very intimate relationship with it. But I also think focusing on pleasures of the flesh are imperative for moving into a future of true deep pleasure that doesn't have as many consequences. If that answers your question.
Yes. And I was just thinking about how it relates to queer activism during the AIDS crisis, and how like there's a lot of iterations of that, like pleasure and danger at the same time. So I think that, yeah, it's super nice what you're doing.
Yeah, I just want to add that you use a lot of play on words to sort of bring up this sort of paradox in a sense. And I think there's a lot of poetry in your work that is really powerful. So thank you so much. Jens, you want to go ahead and introduce Van? If there's any other questions to Madeleine, feel free to throw them in the chat. I know Zoe had already put in that term. So
let's do Zoe's question and then we go for Van.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so just going back to the question of would your practice intersect with the concept of ecofetishism? And Zoe's concept is ecofetishism is a form of environmental activism based around nature fetishism, the idea of the earth as a lover. So a sexual orientation based on the perception of earth environment as an active part of the sexual relationship, which in your case might be totally different point of view on the same discussion.
Yeah, I guess this ecofetishism I am familiar with, I guess, is ecosexuality. Like Annie Sprinkle is big in that movement. And I think some of her work has been inspirational to me. I think I don't think my work or my thought is necessarily coming out of ecosexuality, because I think that is just one avenue of engagement that might be really powerful for some, but I don't think it is a necessary avenue. But I think some of the activism and artwork that's come out of, I guess, ecofetishism or ecosexuality is playful, and I think has inspired me in that it can really interact with like a pop cultural audience and be more about fun and joy as opposed to seriousness and restriction. So I think they're kind of interacting conversations, but not quite the same.
Okay, great. Zoe, I hope that answered your question. If not, Madeline, if you want to drop your email into the chat, if you're up for that, then anyone can also reach out to you later. So go for it, Ian.
Got it. Thanks, Madeline. That was a really nice presentation. Again, really short and sweet. You made it awesome. Now we have Van Basten de Araujo. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce it well. Then you can tell us how to pronounce your name, Van, who comes from Brazil, but is based in Canada at the moment, if I'm not wrong. His PhD scholar focused on how toxic matter affects the daily lives of humans and non-humans, creating long-term health effects, particularly regarding their sexual and reproductive health. And he's interested in furthering these studies on what he calls, I guess, non-spectacular forms of contamination and intoxication that does not happen through large-scale environmental disasters. So Van, thank you for being here, and the stage is all yours.
Thank you. Let me see. Can you see my slides? No.
Yeah, we see it.
Okay. If I pass it, can you see it, right?
Yeah, very flashy. Let's go.
Okay. So first, I wanted to do a land acknowledgement. Right now, I'm in Toronto, which is the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Chippewa, and we are in Treaty 13 of using Indigenous territories. I study at the University of Toronto, so that's why I wanted to make this acknowledgement first. So my presentation today is called Queer Ecologies and Endocrine Disrupting Chemicals. So before we go forward, I just wanted to backtrack a bit and think what are then queer ecologies and what do they do to nature? So as we've seen in both previous presentations, we can understand then how many different ways of sex and sexuality are already present in nature and how they diverge from our general sense of what sex and sexuality is for humans. And this then is one of the biggest themes that emanates from queer ecologies. So this understanding of how we can then unsettle human understandings of things through looking at nature with different eyes. Not nature as the source of loss, but nature as the source of diversity. So for example, when there was this case of lions who were having homosexual sex in a safari in Africa, and then a priest said, well, those lions learned from gay tourists that were partaking in the safari. So this is kind of like how we humans created the laws of things based on seeing what nature is and then try to imprint it into them, but never accepting the way back. So queer ecologies then, at least the concept that I work a lot with is looking at or studying the dynamics across all phenomena, all behavior, and all possibilities. And it's the relation between past, present, and future. I think that this temporality aspect of it is quite important, especially for what I'm going to talk about in just a second, and how we can then also see the multiplicity of avenues that we can take in. So queer ecology is not only about like seeing sex and sexuality in nature, but also like being critical of any concept of nature and environment that is really circumvented and that is really limited to something specific. It's just like broadening our horizons and like disrupting many of those settled concepts that we just work with, such as nature or binary sexes or even identity or use of land and etc. So I feel like the queer of queer ecologies is not the queer of the queer related to LGBT culture, but queer of queer theory. That theory that came in the 90s to disrupt much of the queer theory and the postmodern theory that was in vogue at that time. So it's much more about disrupting the normalization of things and disrupting concepts that are normalized. So the title of my talk was that I was looking into queer ecologies and endocrine disrupting chemicals. So what are those endocrine disrupting chemicals? So EDCs are synthetic compounds that alter the hormone systems and can cause adverse health effects. EDCs are the same shape as the hormones. So rather than poisoning the body, they are recognized by receptors in the body. So hormones that are responsible for coordinating genetic activity, protein production, cellular metabolism, and tissue development are then not produced because the body reads those compounds as hormones. Then the hormones who guide the chemical processes that activate and repress gene exceptions, they are shaping the production of these proteins, and then they have this subtle, long-lasting effects on individuals, their descendants, and on populations. So because of how gene expression works, if a mother is exposed to the EDCs, this could affect their unborn children. And then the sensitivity to these EDCs are also greatest when hormone systems are working at its height, which means fetal development, infancy, and childhood, puberty, and also during breastfeeding. So this endocrine disrupting chemicals are basically chemicals that have a very similar structure to hormones. And then when you're contaminated with them, instead of like your body trying to fight them, your body is going to welcome them because they're going to read it as hormones. And then the first reaction that the body has is stop producing hormones because they understand that we already have them in our body. And then this disrupts the whole thing when it comes to gene expression and et cetera, as I just read. So my research focus is on pesticides. So pesticides, and especially glyphosate, which is produced by Monsanto and has the commercial name of Roundup, is an endocrine disrupting chemical. And in Brazil, where I'm studying, and they use these pesticides near rural areas where then they do air drifting. So they use planes to spray this pesticide on the plantation field. And what happens is the pesticide goes through only like affecting the plantation, quote unquote, to affect all the surrounding areas. So people who live nearby, they are also being sprayed with pesticides. And they have then this long lasting health effects, not only to their body, but to the body of their future daughters, sons, or whatsoever. So when in the beginning I was using this concept of queer ecologies that is about past, present, and future, is actually about this future part also, that endocrine disrupting is not only about you, but your progeny. Then why focusing on this? I think that it's important then to look into especially agriculture because of how the idea of sustaining life is very much entrenched in this idea of producing food, and that's how we get life together, or how agriculture is related to life in many ways. And then through this disruption of the hormones, we have then a blockage to reproduction. So women who are affected by disrupting chemicals such as this type of pesticides, they are most probably gonna suffer from a miscarriage in case they are pregnant. If they are breastfeeding, they're probably gonna pass on the chemicals through their breast milk to the baby, or in women and men, it can cause lower sperm counts in men, and in women, they can become barren. So all the reproductive part of it is, the human reproductive part of it is basically disrupted. And if we think about agriculture, which is basically plant reproduction, we can see how then production and reproduction are closely connected, and how we can mess up with plant reproduction, but we at the same time are doing the same to human reproduction, but not to all humans, but to those humans who are living in rural areas and most probably are in economic disadvantage and with less access to infrastructures, and most probably are also non-white communities who live as agricultural workers. So then there is a lot of like things to think through this political economy behind what this endocrine disrupting chemicals can do in terms of economy and what agriculture is. But then now returning to the topic of today, which is the queer ecology of it, I wanted to show how then this disruption of sex and not sexual, of sex or biological sex is what catches people's attention. So Hines is this endocrine system scholar who graduated from Harvard. And then in the early 2000s, he was doing research for Syngenta, who produced this pesticide called paraquat, which is also an endocrine disrupting pesticide. And he was supposed to write an report saying that paraquat was not dangerous. And then when he did his research, he was like, well, it's very dangerous. because it's affecting on the gonadal formation of frogs, because they were testing on frogs. So he was like, well, those frogs are becoming transsex, and I cannot say that this pesticide is not dangerous. And then instead of writing the report that Syngenta wanted, he started writing to the public and to newspaper saying paraquat is dangerous. And then after this, there was this sex panic going on in the US where everyone was like, oh my God, what are we doing to our community? What are we doing to nature? We are transforming everyone into gay and transsex. So there was this newspaper title that was kind of interesting, that it says, Kermit the frog is now transsex. How pesticides are transforming the sexuality of nature and blah, blah, blah. And most of the cases, and also in Heinz reports, he was saying how masculinity and how the future of reproduction was in danger because also of the sperm count of men. So he was just saying like, oh, we have to take care of our future. We have to take care of our frogs, but not only our frogs, we have to take care of our lives, because in the future, we're not going to have families because we cannot reproduce. So that's the end of family. That's the end of the heterosexual copulation. That's the end of heterosexual reproduction and the end of humanity. But in none of those cases, they were talking about cancer, or they were talking about acute poisoning, or they were talking about all of the other issues that those same pesticides caused. So that's then how pesticides, or those endocrine disrupting chemicals, were creating this gender panic, sex panic in people, and they were not even interested in other health effects and how it would affect their lives beyond what was happening to their gonads or to the sex of the frogs. And then actually later on, some people who actually did research on frogs, they were like, well, the species that he was talking about, they're actually intersex. So it's not that the pesticide was doing that, it was that they were already like this. So there's also the question that he was trying to make a case for intersexuality and other types of gonadal expressions or sex expressions as something chemically created, as something unnatural, although it was natural. So there's also this question of like how our impressions of the binary system of sex and sexuality is very much an imposed natural law, and we do not question when things show up in a different way. So there's always the law and what's against the law of nature. Then I just wanted to bring in this quote from a very good article called Toxic Sexes from 2013, where the authors Eva Hayward and Malin King, who are looking into mostly this EDCs as well, endocrine disrupting chemicals, they question like, can we engender environmental responsibility without invoking anxiety to our most intimate reproductive environments, to how our most reproductive environments have been infiltrated by the industrial world? How do we begin to think freshly and innovatively about environmentally induced sex and body changes without reinscribing gender biases, sexual fears, and old prejudices? How can we discuss the effects of endocrine disruptors seriously without retelling heteronormative understandings of sex biologies? So the idea here is not of closing our eyes to what the EDCs are doing or to what chemical pollution can do to sex and sexuality or to our bodies, but to understand that there is something there, or how we dealt with it in the past was mostly based on taking in very limited concepts of sex, sexuality, and gender, and then imprinting it and then translating it into the natural world, into nature, and trying to then see how our expectations of things should be followed in another environment, in another ecology. And that's when things go wrong, because our concepts, our cultural concepts that might not be applied or might not follow what nature is or what nature looks like. So for example, in the first presentation, there was this rich talk about the many ways that fungi exist, or the many ways that fungi reproduce, and that's about it, right? Like, we cannot simply translate our own concepts to nature because nature follows a different set of rules. Then the idea when analyzing those EDCs is basically to have more of an attentive look into how these induced body changes can tell us about how do we feel about our own bodies, but also what are the futures of sex and sexuality, and how then we can stop seeing sex as this reactive thing, like, oh, sex is going to change because of this exposure to X, Y, and Z, but actually understand that it is always in a process of being constituted because of how we deal with our own sex and sexuality. So it's more of how do we frame things, trying to escape this heteronormative understanding of sex biologies, and then we embrace queerness and queer theory in order to deal with the issues of chemical pollution and what chemical pollution means to our current society that is permanently polluted. Those chemicals are going to stay in the ecosystem for a long, long time. They are persistent, and they are probably going to last way more than our lives, or for the time that we can't leave. They live in a very different time frame than we do. So it's very probable then that we are living in a disrupted chemical world, and in the future, sex is going to look differently from what it is today. So how can we then use queerness and queer concepts to embrace difference rather than substantiate or reinforce heteronormative understanding of sex and biology? Yeah, so that's it. Thank you, and here's my email.
Thank you, Ben. Wow, I'm really impressed with how complex and how multidimensional your research is, coming from so many different directions. I think also what's really interesting is how you bring up different cases about how sexuality is then weaponized from these big companies and from these different chemicals. So are there any questions from the floor, from everyone at home? Jens? Emily?
Yeah, no, go for Emily.
Emily's shaking their head. Okay, so Francie's asking to share Ben, your email into the chat, or maybe even also the presentation that you had, because I think there's a couple of names in there that people would probably want to research. Where are research? Like what are some of maybe the outcomes or your further steps that you want to take, or the further questions that you have? Maybe also, yeah, who you're working with.
Yeah, so my supervisor here in Toronto is Michelle Murphy. I don't know if people know their work, but it's kind of really good. And I want to like really look into what agriculture is for Brazilian economy and how we were pushed into like this international division of labor that pushes us towards being constantly exposed to chemicals. And part of one of the facets of this chemical exposure is this new ways of dealing with sex and sexuality in a country where we have the most amount of queer people being killed in the world, but at the same time, how we have abortion laws that actually are very strict. Like if you commit an abortion in Brazil, you go to prison. But at the same time, you have a government that is throwing pesticides on everyone's head and causing abortions everywhere. So there is then this very paradoxical relationship between reproduction and production systems based on agriculture, and how the government deals with sex and sexuality and abortion. So that's my research. It's basically like the fallacies of the nation state.
Whoa. Okay, that's actually a crazy parallel. Really intense. So Louise has a question now specifically to your work. So how do you see human reproduction changing in the future? Will we counteract by hormone therapy or relying in vitro fertilization and artificial wombs, etc.?
Yeah, so I feel like we are walking towards making reproduction less of a biological ritual, and more of a technological endeavor. So you have IVF, or you have many other ways to affect on reproduction, and also make it less about biology in a way, like you have men and women reproducing and creating this and that. So it's like we are trying to make it less more realistic, and always like trying to experiment with things. So I really do think that it's also about reframing kinship in a way. So if I don't know if everyone knows the work of Sarah Franklin, but she does a really good work on IVF and how it creates different family formations and kinship across the world. So yeah, I feel like we are gonna try to experiment more with technology and try to refrain from connecting reproduction with biology necessarily.
There's one more question. So are there pesticides still being used just because of the lobby power of Monsanto's?
Yeah, so pesticides are being used not only because of the lobby power, that's one thing, but they are being used because of the type of agricultural production that we are using. So we use monocultures, and monocultures are basically huge lands with one type of seed being planted, and that's like Disneyland for any type of pest, because it's like a huge amount of food, the food that you like, and you have free access to it. So monoculture is the problem, because if it was a different type of plantation, if it was agroforestry, for example, or if you have 3 types of cultures being planted at the same time, pests would have a way harder time creating any type of trouble to that plantation. But because it's a monoculture, and because it has no defenses, then you need pesticides basically. So pesticides were created so that efficiency would go higher during the Green Revolution in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But I'm used to say that pesticides were a solution for a non-problem, because before people were not using those types of huge plantations in monocultures, and then they started using it, and then they need the pesticide. So they need a solution to the problem that they created. Although monocultures were already used in the colonial period, but at that time, travels and etc. and the insurgence of pest was way different than now. But yes.
Yeah, and Dree is also asking, and Dree, feel free to step in if you feel like you can ask this question better in person. Do you think companies looking to defend their pesticides / chemicals could ever co-opt with the ideas on your last slide? And Dree, you've turned on your camera, so
I I don't see that happening because they actually fight a lot of any research on the topic, and they try to silence much of those research. Although, like, I think 3 years ago, archives from Monsanto they leaked, and many people are actually reading it right now because it's many different documents, and you can see that they are aware of the impact of those things, and they are just like not talking about it. I don't see them co-opting it because they, I mean, they try to queer wash it. Like they say, oh, we have queer employees, or we are queer this, queer that. And during Pride, they put rainbow flags everywhere, but they are not actually interested in seeing the queerness of what's happening. But I'm also like not making a case for pesticides because they make people queer. I'm just saying that queer theory has better conceptual frameworks to understand the chemical implications of the world that we are living in. And at the same time, I don't want people to panic over queer expressions of sex and sexuality. Like, it's not a bad thing that we have intersex expressions in life. Like, people are intersex, people are transgender. Like, this is not a reason to panic. You can panic over cancer, you can panic over deaths, you can panic over many other things, but you cannot make a case against transgender and intersex because it's bad, or because you're killing reproduction, or because reproduction is under siege. That's the idea.
Dri, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Now there's a couple more questions. Jens, do you think we have time to go for them?
Let's do that. One more question from, now there are two, from Gesa, Nikita, and then we briefly do a breakout room so people just connect to each other, because we also want to use this place, a platform for people that are interested on this topic, also to get to know each other. So yeah, let's go for those two, and then we do this brief breakout room and we wrap it up, because I see many tired faces. Thank you for holding there. Thank you, Van. It was amazing what you have said until now, man.
Yeah, it's super crazy. So from Giza, regarding your example of trans frogs, did I understand you correctly that abandoning or / disrupting our binary thinking seemed to be more threatening to people than worrying about cancer?
Yes, people were completely bonkers about transsex frogs, and they didn't even mention cancer once. And it was completely madness. People were really going crazy about it. I think that someone dropped the link about Tyrone Hayes here. So yeah, if you look into like his history, he was really making a case against queerness, and completely forgot about all the other impacts of that pesticide in specific.
Can I just personally add, is there any other cases that you can think of that have very similar parallels? I know that there's been something about medications and fish sexuality and reproduction. Are there any other cases that you can think about?
Yeah, so endocrine disrupting chemicals, there are in many places, like plasticizers are endocrine disrupting chemicals. Pesticides are the same, PCBs are also. Madeline was also talking about petroleum. Many of the petroleum chemicals are also EDCs. So if you look into what's happening now in Canada, here in Ontario, where they have mining for petroleum and natural gas, and in the lake, you have many ECDs going around and disrupting people's endocrine system, and also natural life endocrine system.
Okay, yeah, that's heaps. Okay, so Nikita, it's a long question. Maybe you want to ask it yourself? No, okay. In the library. All right, so Nikita was wondering if you could speak to the particular effects produced by your case on feminized frogs in popular imagination.
Okay, so your work has an effect. Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of the affect that is involved. It's the panic, because anything that goes against the family or reproduction or futurity is creating this affect. I feel like the biggest panic right now is the fear of not having future, or like being the end of humanity. Like, we're not going to be able to reproduce, we're not going to be able to have children, or our children are not going to be able to have children of themselves. So when I was talking about like queer ecologies being about past, present, and future and temporalities, it's about that. So how then these EDCs are not affecting only us, but our future generations. And this lack of future is what makes people panic a lot. But also in the present, I think that the panic is also related to misogyny. So it's this fear of the feminized world, is the fear of the castrated man, the fear of the castrated masculinity, chemically castrated masculinity. So I feel like, yeah, so the panic today is much about sexuality and the lack of future, or what the future is going to look like.
Okay, wow. Very good. You're really, really great articulated speaker as well, Ben. I think breaking the really complicated concepts really well together. So thank you so much. And thank you to all the speakers. Jens, take it over.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. Thank you, Van. I think also your introduction to queer ecology at the beginning of your presentation was key for some of the participants, because we didn't define it actually on purpose, because it's actually such a broad topic that may have several definitions. And like you said, that is your own definition. And we saw different definitions the last session with the students here participating, but I think one of the definitions is that there are no definitions. That's about queer knowledge, right? So now we will have just hold there some more minutes. I really thank you for your patience, all of you. We will have a little breakout room session. You will be there with 5 to 6 people, and you just have to tell your name, what do you do, which is your background, and also which is your favorite queer species, to make it this a bit more creative. We won't have much time, just 5 minutes. It's just to get to know each other. Maybe you see there's somebody working in something cool, you want to know a bit more about that, and then you connect the person after this session. So I will now make the sessions, so you all may go there. We get back here around 5 minutes, and then we wrap it up. There we go.
Hey, Van.
Sorry. Hi.
Hi. Let's wait for more people.
I think it's 5. No, yeah, it's 10.
10 people.
Thank you, Van, for such an amazing presentation. It's very
That was nice.
I'm gonna talk in the meanwhile, because here in Concepcion, where we are based, many of us, and well, the art school, it's like the kingdom of monoculture in Chile. And Chile is a huge producer of cellulosa. I don't know how to say this. Anyway, it's super interesting that you brought up this perspective, especially for us that are surrounded by this. It's really such a huge environmental problem around us. So it's it's super interesting. And
yeah. My research also focused a lot on history of Latin America and how did we become this agriculture field for the world? You know, like how are we supposed to feed the world, and how we were pushed into that through colonization, and what that means.
Yeah,
so yeah,
how this represents right now for us also with the elections and this extreme right-wing mentality, which is also monoculture. Absolutely, it's also a mentality, and as Vandana Shiva says, also this idea
yes, the monoculture of the mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And the screen, I always see the landscape here around, and I see really these the green deserts. Also, she says, like, you know, these plantations are really like, they look green, but actually they're deserts, and that's
Yeah.
totally, yeah, it's such an issue right now here. So I guess we are already 6. So Luis, Ariel, and Sarah. So, yes. So we got also a question. I don't know if it's gone. Did you guys read the message we got?
Let me see.
Jens added like a question. I don't know where it went.
Yeah, it's not in the chat though.
No, I'm just, Jens is the expert in the rooms.
I think we should like introduce ourselves, then explain our field of expert, and mention our favorite queer species. And then I can't remember.
Yeah, it's well, I'll start, and then we at the end we should share our like favorite queer species. That's the last task. So I'm gonna start. So I'm Elisa Balmaceda. I'm based in Chile, in Concepción, in the south of Chile. I come from the visual arts, but mainly working in the cross fields between like visual arts, science, natural sciences, environment, and also technology. I also studied masters on art and technology in Germany, in Cologne, in Köln. And I'm teaching here at the university and on the lab on art and ecology. And I'm really happy to be expanding our creation. It's a space where we try to create knowledge together as a group, not really as a teacher. And really happy to share this space with you through this seminar. So maybe Van, you can maybe continue.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm doing my PhD in Women and Gender Studies at the University of Toronto with a cross appointment at the Environmental Sciences Department. I did my MA in Vienna in Critical Gender Studies with a specialization in visual cultures. And my research is basically about the environmental humanities, queer ecologies, and how we can use queer theory to assess environmental damage.
Great, thank you. Then maybe Luis. Jens is here.
Hi, my name is Luis. I'm doing my master's in molecular biology in Munich. And I'm really happy to be in this intersectional space and learn about different perspectives because while I mean, utilitarian nature science really dominates the sciences, it's really good to get different perspectives that we are otherwise really deprived of and cannot get in our university department.
Great, thank you. Ariel?
Hi, I'm an art student from Concepción, Chile, and I don't know what to say. I'm actually really new into these topics about ecology, and I have been recently participating against a huge project that it's been taking place in my city, and I'm really thankful for this experience because these are topics that are not usually taught in our classes. So I'm really thankful for being part of this seminary. That's all.
Thank you, Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah and I'm from near Munich. I'm also currently studying at the LMU in the master's program Evolution, Ecology and Systematics. And yeah, I'm currently like focusing on evolution and also.
Great, thank you. Then our last task for the groups is that we think of queer species to like. You can maybe also make it up. I mean, it could be whatever you feel like proposing. And then the idea is that we write it down in the chat, because we are still able to open the chat here, like the whole group. So mine is actually I have one here. Do you see it? To like it.
Sorry, I just lost internet connection.
Oh, don't worry. We are going to write down now in the chat our. We can also share it like speaking, but we have, I guess, 1 minute left. Our favorite queer species, or one you like. So
that's a difficult one.
I'm gonna go for the lichen. That was already in the first presentation. Actually, I really love, and they are like also bioindicators of air pollution in the future. I guess they will become like really important technologies as species. It was also very interesting connecting to Silke's presentation. So who do you want, any of you to share your favorite queer species?
I think the first thing I think of when I hear queer species is the Trill from Star Trek.
That's great.
I don't know if you know about them.
Not much, me at least. But
like, because they're sort of like symbionts, or like there's these trill symbionts, which are like worms, and like a trill humanoid person can then have like a symbiont inside of their belly, and then they sort of share.
Hello, I think everybody is back again. All right. So I hope you have fun. I was jumping between breakout rooms and I saw people interacting, so I expect so. Just one thing that I want to mention before we end up this session is that we have a little Google document, which is like a community library for the seminar, which I will share now with you all here in the chat. So if you have any recommendations on podcasts, videos, texts, or films, or whatever, feel free to write down your recommendation in that link.
Geza is going to be dropping in a film about snail romance. Right?
That's a good one.
A French one.
I wanted to add also, well, thank you so much to all our guests. Today was really, really super great and interesting. Thanks to Van, Madeleine, Silke. And also we had this last, like in the rooms, we had this little task of choosing your favorite queer species, and it would be really nice if before leaving you could write it down in the chat. So we will create a little archive of it just before you leave. So thank you also everybody for joining us today, and we will have 2 more sessions, open sessions coming up. You can see the details in the program. So I'll go for mine, which is lichen. Yeah.
Yeah, also thank you from my side for these amazing contributions. So that was really nice. And our breakout room was very nice as well. So yeah, I'm really looking forward for the next seminars.
If anyone has any other questions for the speakers, you can either email them directly or also send it to the Jens and he'll light it forward or something. So we never got back to the question. So yeah.
Cool. Then I will close the session. Thank you all for being here.